Well, good evening, class. This is Sunday evening, and it's the end of what has been a rather interesting, I think we'd have to say, week 2, and the beginning of what I hope will be a pretty good week 3. Uh, Many times we've had change, right? And that was one of the themes of the week's work was change and handling change, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And we certainly did have a change this week. Many of you were not expecting a new instructor, and I was not expecting to teach this class this month. So we're kind of in it together from different sides, and I hope everything goes smoothly, and I'll try to do what I can to make it work. But what I thought I'd do after jumping in and having to come in so late in the week is, rather than address a lot of the discussion board postings that were up already by the time I got into the class on Thursday, there were over 45 posts. Read them all right away, a lot of very good information, and I just decided that maybe what I would do is wait till the end of the week, like I'm doing right now, and try to address the entire lot of the discussion board postings. I'm going to be grading pretty much going to the rubrics that Professor Watchfogel had put into the syllabus, and we're going to be following, at least for the next week, the syllabus pretty closely. Unit 3, you will see, is very much the same material that Mark Watchfogel would have brought to you, and in fact some references are there to his doctoral work. And what I'm going to try to do is bring in my perspective on the same materials. As Dr. Morose explained to you in our original announcement, I designed a lot of this course, so for me it's a matter of refamiliarization and moving forward in a maybe slightly different way, and hopefully you're going to get the best of all worlds. What I'd like to do right now, and I have a couple notes here if you see me referring down to pages in front of me, I just want to talk a little bit about where you'll be going in week 3, and then I want to back up and talk a little bit about things that I saw in the week 2 material and give you some of my perspective about things. One of the things I really try to do, by the way, is simplify. I have this feeling that there's two professions in the world that try to make things really, really complicated when sometimes they're really, really simple. And those two professions are consultants and college professors. And gee, guess what I was before I became a college professor? I was a consultant. So I should be pretty good at making things complicated. But I'm also pretty good at recognizing when we're doing it. So I'm going to try to simplify some things too. So looking ahead to week 3, it seems like a lot of material there. But the big themes you're going to see in week 3 are, we're going to be talking about emotions and behavior, and needs and behavior. We'll look at some very interesting things. I'm going to have emotions and attitudes. You'll see a lot of beginning near the beginning of the week in chapter 4. It does talk about the development of attitudes and emotions. I have a very simple definition I use for attitude. Attitude is a habit of thought, and keep that definition in mind as you read through the material in chapter 3, and I think that may make things a little simpler for you. The other thing you're going to move on to is something that a lot of us have heard about in other contexts and other classes, is the famous Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and how does that affect people's behavior, individual behavior, and then remember their behavior as they go forward and fit into organizations. People behave according to the conditions they find themselves in, and according to their stages in their own development. So a lot of things are in there. You know, one example I'd love to give you talks about in chapter 5, chapter 4. Talking about, you know, people responding to conditions of their employment. And I always like to, again, a simple example, I always like to put it into this one. Ever walk into a store and come into a sales rep, and they've just been yelled at by their boss. They've just been told that they're inadequate, stupid, done something wrong, growled at, the whole 9 yards. Treated like the minimum wage employee that they probably are, and altogether not made to feel too good about themselves. and you walk in and want help, and you wonder why they're not particularly interested in helping you. Excuse me, where are the white dress shirts? Over there. A lot different than, oh, excuse me, sir, let me show you. Um, just a little story to keep in mind again as you read the chapter. So those are the kind of things we're going to be exposing ourselves to. And then the video at the end of the unit, Dan Pink. Dan Pink was Al Gore's speechwriter in the Bill Clinton years. And he's become quite well known as an author on the subject of motivation and theories of motivation. And he's a very entertaining speaker. And what he's going to talk about in that last video is the whole idea of why business doesn't do what science knows. I think you're going to find that a very, very entertaining, but a very informative video at the same time. Okay, what I'd like to do now is just shift gears, shift my pieces of paper here, and just talk a little bit quick review about what I think week 2 was about. And as I said, I'm going to be going back in now, having read through the entire discussion board. I'm going to be rereading your case analyses and grading according to the rubrics you've already been given. So that's coming. I hope to have that done relatively quickly, and so that you'll be getting adequate feedback about what you've understood, what I think we need to work on, and where you stand, because I think that's the fair way to do it. But I think the big themes that we had in week 2, we looked quite a bit about at the whole idea in chapter 2. One of the biggest things that stood out for me was the discussion of ethical principles, where we talked about 3 principles. The utilitarian principle, which really talks about doing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. A rights-based principle, that people within groups have certain fundamental rights, and if the group or the organization doesn't address those rights, or does address them in a way that maybe they're not expecting, how that can affect their behavior. And the whole idea of distributive justice, that people in similar groups, similar people or similar groups of people deserve similar benefits, and a lot of things can happen there. Just gender equity is a glaring example of that. So that's one of the things that's there. And then chapter 3 got into, I think, the idea that I have about that ABC model, antecedents, behavior, consequences. I think is a very simple way of looking at things. The antecedents are conditions and actions that are going to happen, and then all of a sudden something happens and there's behavior, and the employee does something and there are consequences. And sometimes we don't really track the 3 of them together and we don't understand what does what to what. And I think that's an important one to go back and keep in mind as we go through. But the discussion board seemed to be all about the topic of change and managing change. Why don't we manage change well? Why don't we handle change well? What can happen with change? And in consulting in particular, that's one of the biggest things we deal with, is helping companies and people deal with change. And in my practice for years, I used the model that's of organizational behavior, of individual behavior, a little different than what's in the book, but a lot of similarities to it. And we call it the DISC model, and I may discuss it in greater detail later. But one of the tenets of this model is we can show people where there's one of the 4 behavioral styles, the predominant behavioral styles that people have, that is held by the greatest number of people in the population. And that happens to be that style, which we call the steadiness characteristic, which doesn't like change. And that's the biggest group. It's about 42–44% of the population just doesn't like change. And it's not that people don't like things changing, they really resist being changed. And they don't mind change itself, but they resist being changed. And one of the things I think we saw coming through in arguments with people A lot of people talked about buy-in. A lot of people talked about understanding why they were changing. What didn't understand why some of their situations that they were reporting on, what was going on, and results were not what they expected. And my good friend and colleague, Dr. Don Rose, our dean, he has a saying. He always says that it's in the how. It's in the how we present things. It's in the how we present our differences. And I like to say it's in the why. If employees, if members of a group, if individuals understand why something is being changed, they really have a lot more receptive attitude towards implementing that change. And you can find things going on that are really, really predictable. For instance, when you get a new policy or procedure at your job, does it always go as planned? No, generally we find, and we've studied this in many ways, we find that a lot of times performance, actually when we put in the new system, it goes down right away, right? It just drops right off. And what happens? People look at each other and they say, gee, everything was supposed to be better. It's not better. Why did we change? It's no good. And this leads to frustration. And in many cases, it leads to us dumping the project or bailing out of the effort that we wanted to change with and starting something else, which by its own very nature does not help the situation, because guess what? Now we got to change all over again. And things drop off. And I'll probably do a little bit more formal presentation on that later. But change is a very, very difficult issue for a lot of people. My own personal opinion, and again, I'm going to quote my colleague, Dr. Rose, it's in the how. For me, it's in the why. If you can master that and help people get through those two issues, how you do it, and people who understand why you do it, boy, you've got a much better chance of having a more successful change in your organization. So that's a little bit of my take on what I saw in the my first week. I almost said the first week, your second week in the course, and where I think we're going to go in the third. We'll be making some subtle changes as we go along, but I think we're going to be able to have a very successful transition. Things are going to move along smoothly. And I want to say that I really enjoyed the first week's discussion board participation. It's very lively. It's some very good ideas, and I did appreciate that so many people brought in their own experiences, because I think that's what's very important and what'll make things work. So if there are any questions about anything, I've already fielded a bunch of questions from people about circumstances outside the course, about availability, about how we're going to do things. Feel free to contact me. As I've mentioned in the original posting, the email is the best way to get a hold of me. I'm going to warn everyone right now, this week I'm going to be pretty much out of action on Tuesday, attending to some family business. But we'll be working right up through Monday night, and back in the saddle also Tuesday night. So just Tuesday during the day, if you try to get a hold of me, probably a response will be delayed until Wednesday. But all that being said, great work so far. Very interesting circumstances we got put into, and I think we're all doing a good job of handling it, and I look forward to continuing to work with you. Okay, so thank you and good evening.